Pivot tables are one of the most powerful tools in Excel. With very little effort, you can use a pivot table to build great reports and dashboards for large data sets. I am Nabil Murad. Pivot tables can dramatically increase your efficiency in Excel, and learning pivot tables is a skill that will pay you back again and again. So let's dive in. Here is my start file. You can download the exercise file and follow along by clicking on the link below this video. This is a comprehensive tutorial about creating pivot tables for beginners. In this worksheet, I have a list which shows a date, a region, a manager, a customer, cost of goods sold, and sales. What if I would like to create some reports that analyze my data? Like, I want to see the sum of sales for each region broken down by manager. Or, I want to see the average cost of goods sold for each customer for some of the managers. Or maybe I want to calculate the profit which doesn't exist in the source list for each quarter for each region. Although I could create these reports by using formulas and functions, but that would be very tedious, it requires experience, it takes a long time, and it's prone to errors. However, I can create the same exact reports with just few clicks by creating pivot tables. So what is a pivot table? A pivot table is an interactive way of summarizing huge amount of data in a quick, easy, and friendly way. In order to create a pivot table, we have 4 requirements in the source data. Only one of these 4 requirements is a mandatory requirement. The other 3 requirements are just optional. They make creating a pivot table a little easier. The first and only mandatory requirement is to have column headers at top: date, region, manager, customer, cost of goods sold, and sales, because these column headers will become field names in the pivot table. The second requirement is to have records arranged in rows. The third requirement, no blanks in between. And the last requirement is to have blank cells all around. Only the first one is a mandatory requirement. If you have at least the first requirement, then you can start creating your pivot table. In order to create a pivot table, you select any single cell in the source list, and then you go to the Insert tab of the ribbon, and then to the left side of the Insert tab, click on Pivot Table. Alternatively, you can use a shortcut Alt-N-V. When you click on Pivot Table, the Create Pivot Table wizard pops up. And you might have noticed that it recognizes my source data. That's because of the last requirement, blank cells all around, and you can see the dancing ants around my selection. And here Excel is asking me a question: where would you like to create your pivot table? Would you like to create it in a new worksheet, and this is what I'll be doing? Or would you like to create it in the existing worksheet? I just want to show you this second option, existing worksheet, before creating my pivot table in a new worksheet. Right now, the location box is grayed out, but if I select the radio button for existing worksheet, then the location box becomes active. If I move this dialog box to the side, all what I need to do is to select a destination. Many clients click inside the location box, they click on this up-pointing collapse button, they select a destination, they expand, and then they continue. That's just a waste of time. Just by activating existing worksheet, you can select a destination and then hit OK, and you will be able to start creating your pivot table. I'm going to undo this step, Ctrl Z, because actually I would like to create my first pivot table in a new worksheet. So I click on the Insert tab one more time, and then I click on Pivot Table or use the shortcut Alt-N-V. And here I get the same Create Pivot Table wizard. I'll accept the default new worksheet, and when I hit OK, keep an eye on the Sheet tab because a new worksheet will be created. In the new worksheet, 3 things happened. I have this container, we call it the Pivot Table placeholder, and to the right side I have the Pivot Table field list, and up at the top I have 2 contextual tabs being added to the ribbon, the Analyze tab and the Design tab. If you have an older version of Excel, like Office 2010, then the name of the Analyze tab is Options, so you have the Options and the Design tab, but the functionality is exactly the same. Note that the pivot table field list is showing me the different fields available in the source data. And that's why we had only one mandatory requirement, which is having column headers at top. So what I see here are just the column headers: date, region, manager, customer, cost of goods sold, and sales. Creating a pivot table at this point is a matter of drag and drop. You have to envision in your mind how would you like your final report to look like, and it's a matter of drag and drop. What do I drag and where do I drop? We drag the fields from the upper part of the pivot table fields list, and we drop them in one of four drop areas. So I have the rows drop area, I have the columns drop area, I have the values, and I have filters. So if I would like to analyze my data by region, then I'm going to drag the region and drop it into the rows area. And I do that by dragging the region with my mouse, and I drag it down, and I drop it into the rows drop area. Keep an eye on the placeholder on the left-hand side, and the moment I release, Excel immediately populates a unique list of regions. Would you like to see the sales for each region? Then I'm going to drag the sales, and because it's a numeric value, then I'm going to drag it and drop it into the values area. And the moment I release, a sum function has been created. How much time would it take to create the same exact calculation by using a SUMIF or a SUMPRODUCT function? Then here I have the sum of sales for each one of the regions. Should you wish to granularize your report and show the sum of sales for each one of the sales rep in each region, then I'm going in this case to drag the manager as well, and there is no problem dragging and dropping multiple fields in the same drop area. I'm going to drag the manager and I'll drop it below the region. And now I can see for each region the sum of sales for each sales rep in this region. Should you wish to switch the region and manager, then if I drag the region below the manager, then I can see the sum of sales for each manager broken down into regions. You may also decide to restructure your pivot table and change the layout so that you have column headers as well. And in this case, I'm going to drag the manager and drop it in the columns area, and automatically the pivot table will respond and restructure my report. And that's why we call it an interactive way of summarizing huge amount of data. Whenever you drag and drop, it's reflected automatically on your pivot table. Should you wish to switch the columns into rows, then you want to see the manager as row label and the region as column label, then I can do that by dragging the manager back to the rows area and drag the region instead in the columns area, and I was able to switch the columns into rows, and I was able to pivot my data. Now what happens if more records are added to the source list? Would my pivot table include these records in my analysis? That won't happen in case of a list, but it will happen in case of a table. Let me show you what I mean. And to do that, I'm going to simplify my pivot table and drag the region out of the column area. So I drag the region, and you can see as I drag, there is a little deletion symbol hanging to my mouse pointer. I let it go, and now it's gone from the columns area and from the pivot table. I have a total of 19,911 and some decimal fraction. I would like to go and add more records to my source data. So I click on the Start worksheet. And when I click on the Start worksheet, I do have to the right some more records. I'm going to click and drag to select these records, and I'm going to copy them, Control C, and then I go to the bottom of my list and I want to append them, Control V, to add them to the bottom of the list. Now let's go to my pivot table and see if the total has changed. If I go to my pivot table, I still have the same total. What if I go to the Analyze tab and refresh? Would that change the number? Nothing changes in my pivot table. And the reason for that, whenever you are using a list as a source for your pivot table, then adding more records are not included in the pivot table source data. Even if you hit refresh, these records are not included in your pivot table. what do I need to do then? I need to change the data source. And to change the data source, I click on the Analyze tab, and I click on Change Data Source to open a dialog box, the Change Pivot Table Data Source. I can see my original list highlighted, and if I scroll down, I move the dialog box to the side, and I can see that the new records have not been included in the source data. Should you wish, you can delete the source data by hitting the backspace, and then I'm going to select the entire list one more time by clicking and dragging, which is a hassle in case I have thousands of records, and now I can hit OK. Look at the pivot table. The grand total includes the newly added record. I want to undo that, so I'm going to hit Ctrl Z, and then another Ctrl Z, and a third Ctrl Z, and now before copying the new records, I want to convert my source list into a table. How do I convert my source list into a table, and why do I do that? I convert my source list into a table by selecting any single cell, and then on the Home tab, I click on Format as Table and select a style, or I can simply hit the shortcut Control T, T stands for table. When I hit Control T, Excel highlights my entire list, and it recognizes that my table has header, and the box is checked, and here when I hit OK, a new tab will be added to the ribbon, the Design Contextual tab, and my original list will become a table and acquire a lot more functionality. So I hit OK, and my list has been converted into a table. I see the Table Tools Design tab. On the left side of this Design tab, I'm going to give it a name, My Date. I can also apply a different style, so on the right side of the Design tab, I click on the down pointing arrow, and to the upper left corner, I can apply a very simple style that will look exactly like the list, but it is still a table and it has a lot more functionality than a list. Now, creating a pivot table out of a table follows the same exact concept, but it's a lot better because adding more records to the table will capitalize on a feature inside the table called Table Auto Expansion, and these records, whenever you add them, will be automatically included into your pivot table. So let's do that. To create a pivot table, I go to the Insert tab of the ribbon, and then I click on Pivot Table. I want to create my pivot table in a new worksheet, then I hit OK, and I'm going to create the same exact pivot table by dragging the Manager field to the Rows area. And then I'll be dragging the Sales to the Values area. And I get the same exact pivot table with the same exact grand total, 19,911 and some decimal fraction. Now let's go back to the source table and add more records and look at the difference. If I go to the Start worksheet and then I navigate a little bit to the right to copy some records and append them to the table, select the first record, hit the shortcut Shift-Control down arrow to extend my selection, and then I copy Control-C. I go back to my source table, I go down to the last row, and then in the first empty row, I'll be pasting my new record. These records become part of the pivot table. So if I go back to my pivot table, the newly added pivot table, I simply need to refresh. So if I select a single value in my pivot table, go to the Analyze tab and hit refresh, everything updates on the fly. Should you wish to look at the source data, then click on Change Source Data, and now look at that. It's not selecting a range like the case of a list. It recognizes the entire table by its name, and when you add more records, these records become part of the table. In some cases, you might be unable to envision or imagine how your pivot table should look like. Then in this case, there is another feature that comes handy and helpful. If you go to the Insert tab of the ribbon, and here instead of creating pivot table, I'm going to click on Recommended Pivot Tables because Excel will look at the source data and will offer different types of pivot tables. These are like templates. So if you look at the recommended pivot tables, my first example showed the region and the sum of cost of goods sold. If I click on the second one, it shows for each manager the sum of sales, I can go further down and I see different types of pivot tables. I can use any one of these just as a starting point, and I'm going to select the second one because it's the closest one to what I want to create. I want to create a pivot table that shows the sum of sales for each region for each one of the sales rep. Then this one will be a good starting point. And the moment I hit OK, the pivot table will be created automatically for me without dragging and dropping, but I can always modify this pivot table. When I hit OK, then a new worksheet is created. In the row label area, I can see the managers, and then in the values area, I can see the sum of sales. If you want to break it down by region, then simply drag the region to the column drop area, and this is the pivot table I want. In this pivot table, I want to discuss some of the properties of pivot tables. Like, for now, I finished creating my pivot table. I don't need the pivot table field list. The pivot table field list might be docked or floating. If you want to float your pivot table field list and bring it closer to your pivot table or even resize the pivot table field list, you can hover over the title where it says pivot table fields and then you drag it out. You can hover over the border and drag it to expand or drag it up to expand it even more. That's totally up to you. At any time, you can dock it back by double-clicking on the title Pivot Table Fields. When I double-click, I'm docking it back into position. I can also close the pivot table field list completely, and when I close it, if I want to restructure my pivot table and bring back the pivot table field list, I can do that from the right-click menu. You right-click anywhere inside the pivot table, and here you will select Show Field List. That's one way of doing things. Or you can go up at the top to the right side of the Analyze tab. There is a Field List button. This is a toggle button. When you click on it, you are hiding the pivot table field list. If you click on it a second time, then you are bringing back the pivot table field list. I don't need it for now, then I'm going to hide it. When I created this pivot table, I see for the managers row labels and I see for the region column label. And what I would like to do is to create a descriptive row label and a descriptive column label. I can do that by typing, so I can select this cell and type managers, and I can select column labels and type regions. Alternatively, you can do it in a dynamic way by changing the layout of the pivot table. And the layout is available on the Design tab. So if I click on the Design tab, and then I click to the left side of the Design tab, the third command from the left side, Report Layout. And when I click here, if I select Show in Tabular Form, keep an eye on the label. That will automatically bring the labels from the source. When I select Show in Tabular Form, then I have Manager and Region, and that's dynamic. If you don't want to see the labels, then you can hide them by going to the Analyze tab, and to the right side of the Analyze tab, I have Field Headers. So if I click on Field Headers, I'm hiding the field labels if you don't want to see them at all. You can bring them back by clicking on Field Headers. By default, when we create a pivot table, there is a grand total for the columns and grand total for the rows. You can keep them, or you can keep only one of them, or you can hide both of them. All this functionality is also available on the Design tab. So if I go to the Design tab, and to the left side, the second command is Grand Total, we have 4 self-explanatory options. So if you want to turn them off, then you select off, and now I don't see a grand total whether for the columns or the rows. If I click on the down arrow one more time, I can keep it only for the rows, or I can keep it only for the columns, or I can bring both grand totals by selecting on for rows and columns. The subtotal functionality doesn't work unless you add more than one field in the rows area. Then in this case, I want to modify my pivot table and move the region under the manager into the rows area. And to do that, I need to bring back the pivot table field list. As we learned before, I'm going to select any single cell, right-click, and select Show Field List. In the pivot table field list, I want to drag the region into the rows area. So I drag the region, and I want to drop it above the manager. Now I can see for each region the sales for each manager. And note what happened. Right now I have a subtotal, and the subtotal showed the East region, the Midwest region, and so on. You can modify the subtotal and the position of the subtotal, or you can hide it completely. All this functionality is also available on the left side of the Design tab by clicking on the down arrow of subtotals. You can select not to show subtotals like this, or you can bring the subtotal above or below the group. So if I select show all subtotals at bottom of group, now I can see the East total below the East group. If I click one more time under subtotal, I can show it at the top, show all subtotals at the top of the group. And when I do that, it doesn't seem like there is a change, but in order to see it at the top of the group, then I need to change the report layout one more time, and this time I'm going to select Show in Outline Form. Now I can see the subtotal at the top of the group instead of the bottom of the group. You might want to separate each group from the next group by a blank row, and we do that by going to the blank rows command, insert blank line after each item, and when I do this, I'm inserting a blank row separating each group. You might want to repeat each region item, and in this case, I select any cell in the region column and then go to Report Layout, and from here I select Repeat All Item Labels. Let's undo this. Let's remove the subtotal. Do not show subtotal, and let's remove the blank row by going to blank row, remove blank line, and we are back to what we had before. If you want to compact the layout, then you go to the report layout and select show in tabular form. Then I'm compacting a little bit the layout. Now let's talk about formatting in pivot tables. In this simple pivot table, I drag the manager to the rows drop area, I drag the region to the column drop area, and I have the sales in the values area, which results in the sum of sales. I'm going to close the pivot table field list. I don't need it for now. And I want to see what happens if I try to select any single value and then hit the delete key on my keyboard. Then this message box pops up telling me that I cannot delete a single value in a pivot table. That's because the pivot table was created in a pivot table placeholder, if you remember, then it's one single block. I cannot delete a single value. And I would like to capitalize on this option when formatting my pivot table. So I have some numbers and I want to format them. And although I'm selecting one single cell, I can format all the numbers in the pivot table. But in this case, do not use options that are not relevant to the pivot table. So if you go to the Home tab and click on Accounting, that will format the single selected number. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to hit Undo, Ctrl Z. Also, if I right-click and from the right-click menu I select Format Cell, that will open the popular Format Cell dialog box having 6 tabs at the top, and anything I do in this dialog box is not relevant to the pivot table functionality, so selecting Accounting and hit OK will result into the same problem. Then I'm going to undo this, Ctrl Z one more time. Then what do? I right-click, and from the right-click menu I select the option below, Number Formatting. When you select number format, that will open a variation of the Format Cell dialog box. It has one single tab instead of 6, and whatever you do in this dialog box will be applied to the entire pivot table. Keep an eye on my pivot table. I have one single cell selected, but when I hit OK, the entire pivot table is formatted because I used the functionality relevant to the pivot table. You can also apply some formatting for the column headers, for the row headers, for the total row. But instead of applying the formatting one by one or attribute by attribute, then instead apply a style. By going to the Design tab, we have a Styles gallery. If you click on the down arrow where it says Pivot Table Styles, then you see different types of styles. By hovering over any one of the styles, you will see how the pivot table will look like in case you select that style. You can scroll down. You have more dark styles in the lower part. I'm going to select any one of the styles. It's a matter of personal preference. You can also apply conditional formatting to the pivot table. What is conditional formatting? It's a special type of formatting that overrides the regular formatting whenever a condition is met. And I would like to create a data bar conditional formatting that represents each one of these numbers. The bigger the number, the longer the bar. And this is called data bar conditional formatting, and it's available on the Home tab of the ribbon. And note that I'm selecting one single cell, and if I go to conditional formatting and I select data bars, from the submenu I can select any one of the data bars. I'll be selecting the green one. But when I click on the green data bar, only one single cell is showing the data bar formatting. But there is a little options tag that pops up. If you hover over it, you will see a down pointing arrow, and you have three options from the down pointing arrow. The default is selected cell. But what happens if I select the middle option? It will apply the data bar to every number, including the grand total column and the grand total row, which is not really what I want. What do you want instead? Hover over the options bar one more time and select the last option to apply it to the numbers excluding the grand totals. This is exactly what I want. By looking at the data bar conditional formatting, I can tell without reading any number that Daniel is doing great in the East region. I can also tell that George is doing great in the Southeast region because of the length of the data bar conditional formatting. Should you wish to remove the conditional formatting, go to conditional formatting, hover over clear rules, and select clear rules from entire sheet. In this example, I have a pivot table which shows the sum of sales for each one of the sales rep in each region. And I would like to change the summary function. And to change the summary function, I can select any single cell. Like formatting, I don't need to select the entire pivot table. And then I right-click, and from the right-click menu, I can do one of two things. I can select Summarize Values By, and here I see from the submenu, I see the sum, the count, the average, the max, the min, and product. So let's select Average. Keep an eye on the cell in the upper left corner of the pivot table because it says Average of Sales. Should you wish to change the calculation one more time, you can right-click, and this time, instead of going to Summarize Values By, I want to check another option, Value Field Settings. When you select Value Field Settings, here you can see the list of functions. You can select whichever function you want. Here I can also change the label. If I wish, I can make it Total Sales. I hit OK. I have Total Sales here at the top. I can also restructure my pivot table in order to create more calculations. Then I'm going to bring the pivot table field list by right-clicking, and from the right-click menu I select Show Field List. I want to drag the manager below the region in the rows area. And now I want to create another calculation beside the total sales. Let's say I want to see the percentage of the column total. How can I do that? I start by dragging the sales one more time to the values area. And when I drag the sales by default, it creates a sum function, but I want the percentage of the column total. Then in this case, I select a single cell in the newly added calculation, and then I right-click and I select Show Values as Percentage of Column Total. Automatically, not only I get the percentage of the column total for each one of the sales rep, but also for each one of the groups. So I have for the East group, I have the percentage of the column total. If I scroll down, of course, the grand total is 100%. You might also want to create a ranking for each one of the sales rep. So if I right-click and select Show Values As, and instead of the percentage of column total, I want to create a ranking from the largest to smallest to see who are the best sales rep in each region. Then I select Rank largest to smallest, and when I do that, it asks me, would you like to rank the manager column, which is your base field? I have two options in the drop list, region and manager, which are the two fields in the rows area. I'll keep it for the manager and then hit OK and look at the ranking. Then I have Amanda having ranking number 8. She has the lowest sales amount. I have Daniel having ranking number 1. He has the highest sales amount in this region. I want to remove the ranking column. Then I drag it out. I just drag it outside the pivot table field list and let it go. What if I would like to create a calculation that doesn't exist in the source list? Because in the source list, I have the cost of goods sold and I have the total sales. What if I want to calculate the profit? Then in this case, I can create what we call a calculated field. To create a calculated field, then I go to the Analyze tab of the ribbon. I click on the down arrow for fields, items, and sets, and from here I'll be selecting calculated field. The Insert Calculated Field dialog box opens where I have to name the field that I want to insert. I'm going to name it Profit. How do you calculate the profit? We need a formula, and the formula starts by typing an equal sign, and I can select the fields from the lower box. So I select Sales and then click on Insert Field, and then I type a minus sign, select the cost of goods sold, and click on Insert Field, and I would have created my calculation. The moment I hit OK, not only I would have created a profit field that will appear in the pivot table field list, but it will be also added automatically to my pivot table. So when I hit OK, look at that, I have the profit field, it has been added to the values area, and I can see the sum of profit. Should you wish to change the field name and make it only profit, then you have a little issue here. Let me try to do that. I select a single cell, right click, and select Value Field Settings. In the value field settings, I want to assign a custom name. So if I select profit, now Excel will not allow me to do that. And if I hit OK, it will tell me we already have a profit field, but what you are talking about is the sum of profit. And it gives me this message box. I hit OK. And to bypass this limitation, I click to the right side of profit, type a space, and then when I hit OK, I would have tricked Excel and the name goes through. One of the beautiful functionalities of the pivot table is called the Show Details functionality, or the drill down feature of a pivot table. And to explain this functionality, I'm going to drag the profit out. I'll let it go. I will move the region to the column header to restructure my pivot table. And I want to look at my pivot table. Right now, I can see that the sum of sales of Daniel in the East region is 828.2. I can read that in the screen tip as well. But what if I would like to create a report that shows the individual transactions that added up to this number on the transactions for Daniel in the East region? And this functionality, as I said, is called the Show Details. So if I select this cell and then right click, here is the Show Details functionality. Alternatively, you can simply double click on this cell. When you double click on a number, the report is created in a new worksheet. Let's double click and have a look. Now I have a new worksheet, and in this new worksheet, thanks to the drill down feature of a pivot table, I can see all the transactions in the East region where the sales rep is Daniel. Sorting is one of the important analytical tools in Excel. And sorting simply means arranging our data in a meaningful way. So if you have a text field, you are arranging it alphabetically from A to Z or Z to A. If you have a number field, then you are arranging it from smallest to largest or largest to smallest. And if you have a date field, then you are arranging it from oldest to newest or newest to oldest. By default, when you create a pivot table and you drag fields to the rows area or the columns area, these fields are sorted ascendingly. Then if you look at the manager, they are sorted already ascendingly. If you look at the region, they are sorted ascendingly as well. Should you wish to change this sorting option, then click on the down arrow for manager. This is the header field. And then from here, you have sort A to Z or Z to A. I'll be selecting Z to A to reverse the sort. And here I can see the names have been reversed from Z to A. I can do the same for the region. I can click on the down arrow for the region and change the sort from Z to A if I wish, or I can bring the pivot table field list by going to the Analyze tab of the ribbon and click on Field List. And in the pivot table field list, I can click on the little arrow to the right side and I have the same sorting functionality. I can reverse it if I wish. I'm not going to do that. We also have a sorting functionality on the Data tab of the ribbon. So if I select any cell in the Manager field, I can go to the Data tab of the ribbon and say I want to sort ascending, and here I get a sorting from A to Z. If I restructure my pivot table and bring the region above the manager, and now I can see the total sales for each one of the managers in each region. What if I would like to sort the managers based upon the total sales? So what will be sorted will be the manager, but it will be based upon the total sales. So I want to see the highest sales at top and the lowest sales in the bottom, and I can do that by clicking on the down arrow for manager and I select more sort options. When I select more sort options, you can decide whether you want it ascending or descending. I'll be selecting descending, and I don't want to sort alphabetic by manager. I want to sort based on another field, which is the total sales. When I select total sales and then I hit OK, look at that. Daniel is at the top. He has the highest sales amount, and Amanda is at the end of the list. She has the lowest sales amount. I want to restructure my pivot table to show you another very important analytical tool that we have in Excel, which is filtering. So if I drag the region back to the columns, and I would like to filter this pivot table. Filtering means displaying some of the values, some of the records that meet my condition, and hiding those records that do not meet my condition. I can filter from the existing field by clicking on the down arrow, and I can say I don't want to see all the managers, I just want to see some of them. So by checking and unchecking boxes, I'll be keeping some of the managers. I can do the same for the region, but what we do more commonly is that we filter on another field that's not in the pivot table. And to filter based on another field, we drag that field in the fourth drop area that we didn't use so far, which is the filters area. Have you ever wondered why when we create a pivot table in a new worksheet, it will never start at cell A1? Because cell A1 is reserved for the filter functionality. So if I drag the customer and drop it into the filters area, then it appears in cell A1, and in cell B1 you can read all the customers are represented in this pivot table. Should you wish to exclude some of the customers and keep only part of the customer, then you click on the down arrow of cell B1, and from here, let's say I just want to see Amazon, then I click on Amazon, and when I hit OK, all the numbers change. The label in cell B1 shows that the numbers we see in the pivot table are those coming from Amazon. If you want to select multiple customers, then you click on the down arrow one more time. And in order to be able to select multiple customers, I need to check this box, select multiple items. Now I can see that I have check boxes. If I deselect all, then I check some of the customers like Amazon, Best Buy, let's say Costco, and Staples. When I hit OK, now I get multiple items, and the numbers in the pivot table reflect my selection. Clients complain to Microsoft saying, we don't know who are these multiple items. We want to have a filter that shows us the selected items in our filter. And Microsoft responded in Office 2013 by creating a graphic interactive filter called a slicer. So what is a slicer? A slicer is a filter, but it's a graphic filter, and it interacts perfectly with the classic filter we have in cell A1 and B1. To insert this slicer, I go to the Analyze tab of the ribbon, and on the Analyze tab, I click on Insert Slicer. You can select any field. I'm going to insert a slicer for the customer. Think of a slicer as a filter. And by the way, the slicer functionality is available for regular tables, not necessarily pivot tables. If you go to the Insert tab, you will find this functionality. If I check the box for customer and then hit OK, without having to click on the drop list for the filter and look at the checked boxes, I can tell who are the customers represented. A slicer is floating on top of the grid, and a slicer is used a lot when we create dashboard. That's the heart of a dashboard. I'm going to move my slicer by dragging, and you might have noticed already that we have an Options tab added to the ribbon whenever we click on the slicer. If we deselect the slicer, then the Options tab is gone. If I click on the slicer one more time, I see some options related to the slicer functionality. Like, I want to apply a style to make it easier for me to see the different customers represented. Then in this case, on the Options tab, I click on the down arrow for the style, and I can select any dark style that will make it a lot easier to read. Now I can see the different customers represented in my slicer. Should you wish to release the slicer, you click on the funnel icon in the upper right corner. So to release my slicer, I click on this icon, and now I'm back in cell B1 to all. These are all the customers. If I click on my slicer and select Best Buy, Should you wish to select another customer, then you have to press Control, and I'm pressing Control to click on Costco. I'm pressing Control to click on Sears. If you don't want to use the Control key, then instead you can click on the icon in the upper right corner. To the left side of the icon for clearing the filter, it reads Multi-Select. When you click on this icon, you are able to select and deselect multiple items without using the Control key. I'll be selecting Amazon, I'll be selecting Best Buy, and I'll be selecting, let's say, Zara. I'm selecting multiple items right now, and every time I change my selection or even release my slicer, look at the width of the pivot table changing, and that bothers me a lot because it changes the width of the columns. So if I release my slicer, look at this, the width of the pivot table, the width of the columns change, and I want to stop this functionality by selecting any single cell, and I'm going to change one of the options in the pivot table options by right-clicking, and from the right-click menu, I'll select Pivot Table Options. And here, in the Pivot Table Options dialog box, we have a Layout and Format tab. On this tab, take the check away from AutoFit Column Width on Update. And when you hit OK, the width of the columns is not going to change whenever you make a different selection using your slicer. Now, if I select Amazon, I select Costco, I select OfficeInstructor, nothing is changing. I release my filter, and the column width doesn't change. We have many other options in our slicer. So if I select the slicer, I have 8 sizing handles all around. So I can resize it by dragging from one of the sizing handles. I can make it wider and shorter. And when I do that, that's because I want to split the one single column I have for the customers into multiple columns. So I click on the Options tab, and to the right side of the Options tab, I have the number of columns. I'm going to split the customers into 2 columns, expand my slicer a little bit, and that's a lot better than having it in one single column. That's easier to interact. Any change you make in the slicer is reflected on the pivot table and is reflected on the filter as well. So I can deselect some customers by dragging. I'm deselecting all of them by dragging. I'm deselecting most of them. I can make a selection by dragging as well. And because I have the multi-select icon highlighted, then I can make non-adjacent selections by dragging without pressing Ctrl. Microsoft introduced another filter as well, another graphic interactive filter for date and time values. That's called a timeline. Let's go and add a timeline to analyze our data by year, by month, by quarter. To add a timeline, I select any single cell, I go to the Analyze tab of the ribbon, and on the Analyze tab, I click on Insert Timeline. And because it's the only field I have that is related to date and time, then I'm going to check date, and that will add the timeline automatically. Here is my timeline. It's a filter for date and time. So I can read 2019, and if I select July 2019, now my pivot table is filtered and showing numbers only for July 2019. I can drag the handle a little bit to the right to include July, August, and September, and as you can see, all the numbers change to reflect my selection. Whenever you select a timeline, there is a Timeline Options tab added to the ribbon. On this tab, I can apply a style. I can select any style I want, like this one, or I select a matching style. I can also hide this horizontal scroll bar by going to the top right corner of the Options tab and take the check away from scroll bar. That removes the scroll bar. I can release the filter in the timeline applied to the date by clicking on the funnel icon in the upper right corner. Then I'm bringing all the numbers back. Now I can see the date level by month, and I can see this label all periods. If you don't want that selection label, then you can take the check away from header. That will remove the date. If you take the check away from selection label, that will remove all periods. You can expand your timeline to see this horizontal bar. Now I'm going to change the time level from month. I want to make it, let's say, years or quarters, and I do that by clicking on the down arrow and I'll be selecting quarters. Now I can see 2018 and 2019, and I have a higher level of information. I can select quarter 4 in 2018, all the numbers change, expand it to quarter 1 in 2019, and the pivot table updates automatically. Although removing the header creates a cleaner timeline, but I don't have the little icon for clearing my timeline, then I'm going to bring the header back by checking the box for header, and that brings the funnel icon that I use for releasing my timeline. We talked about different types of filtering. Filtering from the labels, filtering by dragging a field to the filter drop area. We talked about the graphic interactive filter, which is the slicer, and we talked about filtering date and time value by adding a timeline. To remove a timeline, select the timeline, right-click, and select Remove Timeline. Same exact concept. To remove a slicer, select the slicer. This is a customer slicer. Right-click and select Remove Customer. Now I want to restructure my pivot table, and I want to represent the numbers graphically by creating a pivot chart. So to restructure my pivot table, I'm going to remove the region, and I'll be adding it as a slicer later on. Now I want to create a pivot chart. Then I select any single field in my pivot table, and I can create a pivot chart either by going to the Analyze tab and select Pivot Chart, or by going to the Insert tab and select the type of chart I want, or I can create the default chart by using the shortcut Alt F1. I created the default column chart, and this column chart is linked to the pivot table and it's linked to the filter. I want to improve the appearance of my pivot chart, then I can remove the filter buttons. And to remove the filter buttons, you can click on the pivot chart and then go to the Analyze tab and click on Field Buttons, or you can simply right-click and select Hide All Field Buttons on Chart, and we would have removed all the field buttons and my chart grows bigger. Although I'm not focusing in this tutorial on chart functionality, but I'm going to show you some of the basic terminology and some of the basic formatting for a chart. I can get rid of the legend, which is the color key, by selecting it and hit delete. And I can add a title to my pivot chart by selecting total. And I want to say this is the total sales per manager, so I type. Whatever I type appears in the formula bar. I hit enter and it appears as a title to my chart. I can also get rid of the horizontal grid lines by clicking on one of them. I'm selecting all of them, and then I hit the delete key to remove it. I can select one of the columns, and one click on one of the columns, select all the columns. When I select all the columns, I want to format them, reduce the gap, and change the color. Then I'm going to hit the golden shortcut of Excel, Control-1. This opens the Format Cell dialog box, but because I'm selecting a chart, it opened the Format Data Series. And by the way, I don't need the pivot table chart fields for now. I need more room, so I'm going to close it. And here, to reduce the gap between the different columns, I'm going to drag my slider a little bit to the left, and I want to change the colors of the different columns. Then I go to this icon, the Fill and Line icon. When I click on it, I have a fill option. I click on the little triangle to the left side of the fill option, and I want to change the color of each column, so I select Vary Color by Points, and I would have created a simple pivot chart. This pivot chart interacts fully with my pivot table. So if I make any change from my filter by selecting All, and then I hit OK, now all the numbers change and my pivot chart updates. I can also create another slicer for the region that interacts with my pivot table and my pivot chart. And to do that, I select any single cell. I go to the Analyze tab of the ribbon, click on Insert Slicer. I want to create a slicer for the region. I hit OK. Here is my slicer. I'll put it below the pivot chart. I want to resize it as I did before. And then I want to split it into multiple columns. Then I go to the Options tab and split my slicer into 3 columns. I can expand it a little bit and then add a style and test the functionality. Now this slicer is linked to the pivot table, which is linked to the pivot chart. So if I select the East region, all the numbers change. If I select the North region, all the numbers change, and I would have created a dynamic interactive report that showed the sum of sales for some of the customers and for some of the regions according to my selection from the filter and from the slicer. In this tutorial, we explored the basic functionality of pivot tables and pivot charts. Should you wish to learn the advanced functionality, then watch my tutorial about advanced pivot tables, tips and tricks. And if you enjoyed this training video, give it a thumbs up. And make sure you subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to be notified when new tutorials are released. The best is yet to come. Thanks for watching and see you next time.